Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we talk to foresters about how they are using digital technologies in their day-to-day forestry work. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast. Today, it's my great privilege to introduce you to Scot McQueen. He's the Senior Technology Officer at Fsc, or Forest Stewardship Council, which if you're a forester listening to this, you know who Fsc is. So Scot, how you doing?
I'm doing great, and I was just excited to hear from you again, Kevin. It's been a little bit, so I'm really excited to be here, and if nothing else, just chat with you to catch up. So
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny when you say, it's been a while. For me, it almost feels like I saw you the other day, even though it's been 2 years just with these days of the COVID. I know I sound like a broken record on every podcast mentioning COVID and the pandemic, but man, it's
yeah,
mind.
time has kind of warped, like you don't know what happened.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, for sure. So I was just commenting earlier before we fired up. Awesome background. It's not a virtual background for those on YouTube.
nope.
People who are listening on the audio, you can't see it, but awesome little workspace. You gave a wood stove behind to describe to our audio folks, but the YouTubers, yeah, pretty cool. So this is your
Yeah.
setup. You go in every day. It's separate from the home environment.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, and all the wood in here was reclaimed wood. It came from the previous owner had a mill down in Onalaska, Washington. I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and all the wood in here was leftover stuff just laying off in the brush, and he resurfaced it, and so it's really a cozy little spot. I'm quite happy to not go into the office, so to speak. So
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I wish I had one of those at my house and I could go hide away from my three rugrats and maybe my better half, but we won't say that out loud. At least it's on the podcast. She doesn't listen to anything I say related to work or forestry or technology, so we're safe. So I'm really excited to chat with you because even though we interacted together while you were working at Esri Inc., I also knew you had a very rich background, and I knew a cool background on the Patagonia Adventures, and we'll talk about that. But with most of our people who come onto the show, I always ask them, like, how did you get into forestry?
yeah, that's a fun question. I've always been interested in environmental science. I actually went to college first at University of Colorado and then finished up at the Evergreen State College here in the Northwest. And for anyone who knows of the Evergreen, it's very much an environmental cross-disciplinary sort of school, liberal arts, but I got a science degree from there as well. And that kicked me off into my career with the Forest Service. I actually worked for the Forest Service during the tail end of the spotted owl crisis, the President's Forest Plan, all that sort of stuff. So my background, so what I did for the Forest Service was GIS actually, but my background was actually going out and doing watershed analysis and looking at the forest health and mapping all of it. And so for me, I've always been just really interested in the play of technology's potential to affect a really old profession industry like timber and logging and forestry. And so that's just kind of carried me all the way through. So
Yeah, very, very, very cool. And you, I would say, had, as I said, a cool storied career. Maybe share our listeners what that looked like, because obviously you're in the GIS space, and we'll delve into that a little bit more because you've seen stuff I've seen. Times have definitely changed from back in that period,
definitely.
right? And it's continuing to change. But you've been in that technology space. You've been in leadership roles. Portfolio management, project management. High values, multi-million dollar initiatives, programs. And so we think about that at some point. I'm curious also to understand in that journey, if you tell us about it, there was, I don't want to say it was a side trip, but the Patagonian adventure things, I'm dying to hear more about this. But for our listeners, maybe walk us through after the Forest Service, tell us about that technology career.
Yeah, so the Forest Service kind of got me going with technology, and GIS was the gateway drug for me to get into technology. And at that time, I worked on kind of a cutting edge project with a forest ecologist by the name of Dave Peters. Dave and I worked on mapping the entire Olympic Peninsula, but we were interested in mapping fires and prehistoric fires, if you will. So a lot of people didn't realize this, but the Olympic National Park, the Olympic Peninsula here in Washington State, burns over in catastrophic fire events every couple hundred years. So this work we did with mapping these prehistoric fires, overlaying harvest stands and all sorts of different things on top of it, I made a model, a computer model based on Esri technology, and you could put in and see where the old growth, the static old growth, the true old stuff that had not been messed with was, and primarily it was in the riparian areas. So they used that model to lay out the president's forest plan, the best practices as we know them, riparian boundaries, all the rest of it. So for me, that was like this kind of epiphany of, wait a minute, this industry and natural resources in general, there's so many applications for technology. So that got me jacked up on it. I went to work for Esri at that point as a developer and as a solution engineer, or demo jock, we used to call them. And I did a lot of work there. And then I went over and in my career at Esri, I started as a developer. I was an instructor for a long time as part of that. But then I took on the Northwest Regional Office's professional service team. And at my heart, I'm a problem solver, and I'm happiest when I've got some really meaty problem that I'm working on. And for me, consulting was just, I mean, I loved doing consulting. It was my favorite thing to go out and work with customers. But in that course of working and managing that consulting team, I worked for Weyerhaeuser during when they all, well, started actually with Plum Creek Timber, and when they converted to a REIT. And I got to work with Rick Hawley, who was the CEO at that time. And I actually got this kind of really cool interaction with a CEO and understanding how a CEO needs to see at a high level forest what's going on with the holdings and the management of the forest in a way that allows them to make business decisions that have a deep impact. So Rick Hawley's whole thing forever, and you know, this is going back a few years, he used to say, I just want to know how many acres I own. And at that point, you know, Plum Creek had 7 million acres or whatever it was. And it would take 3 months to get an answer, and they were 3 or 4 different answers. So that idea of how technology also needs very good data to work with, and it's a hand in glove thing. So it's not just technology, but the data aspects of it was really interesting to me as well. So from there, I actually left, and I left Esri and went to work for a company called Geoengineers, which was an earth sciences and engineering company. And I ran their revenue generating technology team. So we had some go-to-market applications for hydro dams. We did a lot of work in product development. And so fantastic team, fantastic time there. I really enjoyed, again, my work because it was kind of this pairing of consulting, working on hard problems with customers, but then also the potential pivot to products out of that work we did with those customers. And another example was we worked, I think it was with Puget Sound Energy at the time, and they were tracking bird kills from the windmills and other electrical things, and you have to report that out. So we helped them and built out an app that turned other utility companies started using as well. It was called Avian Audit. So anyway, that was my stint. I was there for 7 years, really enjoyed doing that work. Esri called me back. I'm a rehire, a repeat at Esri. I went back working for Esri and took on their global commercial forestry accounts. So I was all over. And that was fascinating to me too, because I really got to know the timber industry globally, not just the Pacific Northwest or the West Coast, but what's going on in Finland and Sweden, and Germany and South America, Klabin down there. And I had a great time. And then the pandemic comes, and it kind of makes you reshift and think about things. And I hate to say this, but I'm kind of at the tail end of my career, we'll just say. And I thought, you know, where do I really want to work? How can I have an impact in an industry that I'm pretty passionate about. And the Forest Stewardship Council came up, and anyway, there's a whole, well, hopefully we'll get into more of what's
Yeah,
going on at the Forest Stewardship Council. But I
absolutely.
did want to go back to your Patagonia piece of this as well. So I had a stint where one of the things I did for geoengineers was went down to Patagonia. I was working with the Nature Conservancy. It was actually a consulting project. And I went down there to help Patagonia, the Patagonia government and the Nature Conservancy, Patagonia Clothing. And there were a few, oh, the actual sheep farmers were involved in it too. Patagonia Clothing wanted to certify their wool for their clothing so they could say it was sustainably
Interesting.
farmed. So I went down there and we ran this workshop. It was a week and a half down in Bariloche, Argentina, which is in the northwest corner of Argentina, and worked with Patagonia and with the Patagonian government, and the Nature Conservancy was who was hosting all of it, right? They were the ones pulling these pieces together. One thing the Nature Conservancy is really good at doing is being an intermediary. And so out of that, what it was my first exposure to this idea of certification, as well as how do we connect the sheep farmer to the actual customer out here on the other end of that supply chain.
Yeah, yeah.
That supply chain certification, and I call it now the transparent supply chain or the visible supply chain, knowing where you got the wool or the wood and getting a higher value for it because you can connect directly with the customer in the end. That's exactly where I'm at here at the end
Yeah.
with our friends at Forest Stewardship Council. So
Yeah, that's incredible. It's amazing when I talk to folks on the digital forestry. There's this pattern where everyone starts, there's a spark, and they're on their journey. It doesn't matter like start, middle, end, but there's these events that just seem to happen that eventually they make sense when you look back, and maybe they don't make as much sense as where we are now, or maybe looking forward. But there's definitely this trend that I'm hearing from people. So let's talk about technology. You talked about GIS, and so we're probably Oracle, SQL days, a heavy desktop,
oh yeah.
and now things are different. So as we think about forestry, maybe a question to you is there something that unfolded in the technology landscape that one you kind of foresaw coming, and then maybe two that completely caught you from off guard that you just didn't see coming in all your experiences?
So let's go with the one I kind of saw coming, and it started way back with the work I did with that forest ecologist, and that is the idea of being able to model trends, right? How can you create a model that can help you look forward and start to make decisions about things that haven't happened yet? And I mean, come on, that was in the 90s. I was doing that stuff, and it was clunky. There was a lot of moving parts. It was written in AML, all of these things. But there's, again, that kind of spark of, wait a minute, if you can model and do trend analysis, you can start to make decisions about things that could or should happen here. And so that kind of analysis has always got me excited. So I'd like to say I saw it coming, but I wasn't alone. Everyone knew it was coming. And that's the one thing that has really that's always been pretty interesting for me. Things I didn't see coming. Well, I've since I was like 10, I was into science fiction. So science fiction is just basically science or technology that hasn't happened yet in my mind. So a lot of the things in science fiction you kind of think are going to happen. I think that what has been interesting for me is the acceleration of sensors and the sensor integration and equipment. I didn't put all that together. I've always been kind of aware of the potential of artificial intelligence, machine learning, all those sorts of things. But that idea of IoT, the Internet of Things, and wait a minute, you can connect this. It's not just the internet, but being able to connect your harvester head unit to an actual software that you're doing just-in-time harvesting. that's like, holy cow, that's really cool. That wasn't in the Terminator. So
yeah. So that wasn't in the Skynet
no,
playbook there,
no,
right?
no, no.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm secretly giggling inside because you said AML, and so for our listeners, arc macro language. And then again, this is dating us, but the reason it made me chuckle inside is because I think it was we were both at this partner conference where Jack Dangerman, CEO or president of Esri, he always likes to do these polls, right? And I remember one where it was like, AML, like who remembers AML? And then my arm shot up, and I thought there'd be like tons of people, right? And then I looked around, and then I was like, oh my god, it's like there's not that many hands. And then it kind of struck me like, oh, I think I've achieved that stage of career where it's like the youngins don't even know like Arc Info. And I know a lot of our listeners are going to be like, oh yeah, Arc Info, the AE, the shortcuts on the command line, right? Again, other younger digital foresters are probably wondering, what are these two guys talking about? But
Antiques.
Fascinating there. Antiques. And yeah, and it still makes me laugh when you're talking about that Weyerhaeuser example area, 3 different numbers. We know there's still forestry companies out there dealing with that exact same issue today. Something as simple. So definitely IoT, I agree, like this whole movement of connectivity, just in time, near real time, however you want to define that, but leveraging again, if it feels like we're preaching Jack's message, right? Data, then insights, actionable insights, that jargon. But in some respects, Jack's Jack, and if I'm betting, it's like I'm gonna bet on him, and that language really resonates today, even though it may not have resonated at the time, which is often the case with people who are visionaries and thinking forward on that front. But in terms of forestry, like you've been working, you mentioned you're doing like this global commercial forestry stuff. I'm curious to know, in that experience, did you find patterns or associations amongst forestry across these geographic spaces? Were the problems similar or variations of each other? Or was it that drastically different that some are just more quote unquote advanced than other regions? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting to me because there are some marked differences in the industry from continent to continent. And I have very much a North American experience. Canada and the US, very similar in their timber practices and where they're at with technology. Their entrepreneurial spirit is very alive in what they're doing. And also the idea that they're working with real data, right? So they're gonna report and do the things with real data. So then you go to some place, and the wide variety is mostly based on political culture. We'll just call it that. And depending on where you go to Europe, and that entrepreneurial piece it's still there, but it's smaller, and there's a lot more regulation and compliance and other things on top of that, which actually makes it, in my opinion, a more difficult industry to participate in a lot of ways. And one that also they tend to, I kept hearing, oh, those guys in Finland and Sweden, they're so far ahead of the curve with their technology and all the rest of it. And then I went over there, and they're having the same problems as we are too. And they're advanced in some ways. They're reporting and a lot of the things they're doing. I got to work with, one of my favorite customers over in Sweden was Holman. And this is a 340-year-old company. If that's not a sustainable company, I don't know what is. But they've been doing things the same way for a long time. They've got a good machine going. They've got a healthy GIS. And forgive me to Lisa Nielsen's their CIO who listened to this, but some of their stuff, they haven't quite gone into the IoT, or they're not really looking at the AI. And, they have this way of doing things, and it's been very good and successful. They have a very advanced GIS, but maybe they're not looking out a little bit further on the front of the ship there when it comes to technology. And they have some new challenges that are being thrown at them. When I was back, it was like 2019, 2020, they had their first forest fires in the history of their company. They were having fires in Sweden in their holdings, and that had never happened before. So those countries, Sweden's a great example. They have a very good forest practice, and they are more advanced in a lot of ways, but they have new twists that are being thrown on all the time, and so they're being forced to adapt in different ways. And then you go from there to like the Ukraine, and it's top of mind right now what's going on in the Ukraine with
Yeah,
Russia.
absolutely.
But it is a very difficult environment to be I'll call it a good responsible forest manager there. It's very difficult. I met with, some folks from the Ukraine, and their job just in forest certification or the rest of it is really difficult. It's a political environment that's charged. There's corruption. So in a lot of ways, we've got it really good in North America. So I don't know if that
Yeah.
answers the question.
No,
but
for sure. It's interesting to see that global perspective in some of these other jurisdictions, and definitely, when we think, me being in Canada, you being stateside in the Pacific Northwest, there are similarities, there's differences, but definitely I'd say far more commonalities in terms of how business is
yeah,
done, and especially as we look at, the Canfors operate in the U.S.
yep,
Southeast and the West Fraser and Satellite. It
yep.
becomes this blob of like togetherness, if that's even the right way of describing it. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on technology adoption, because again, as you've described it, you love problems, and I do as well. You know me, and sometimes it's the bane of our existence as well. There's the eureka moments we solve it, and you're amped up for a minute, and then it's like, all right, where's the next problem? Where do
Yep.
I go next? And maybe I should sleep. But it's this roller coaster ride, and it can be frustrating, as I know, where you see it so clearly, and it's so
Oh yeah, it's
obvious,
so
and
easy.
it's so easy, and yet it becomes next to impossible to get this change through. What do you think? Why do you think that's it? Do you think it's really limited to the forestry sector? You think it's across the board and it's something more common? But as we think about foresters, I more recently joke it's like healthcare. It's like it just don't move
Yeah.
that quick. It moves at its own pace, and rightfully so. It's very complex. But when you think about those initiatives you're involved with bringing change,
Oh yeah.
what are some of those things you see that gets in the way? And along that line, like, what do you think we can do as people in tech to accelerate, or I don't want to use the disrupt term, but to affect change in a more
Yeah.
faster, meaningful way? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and that's actually that very thing spurred me to make this move to the Forest Stewardship Council, because you are exactly right. I've done a lot of strategic planning in my career where I'd go into an organization, look at everything they've got going on, their IT plans, their business needs, all the rest of it, and you could put together this amazing strategic plan. But there's an old saying, and I'm sure you know it: culture trumps strategy every time. And so if you miss the culture of the industry, of the organization, of the micro teams that you're working with, you're going to not be successful. And so if we think about forestry as an industry, as a practice, it is a we grow trees, right? Trees, it takes 60, 80 years, 40 years, depending on where you're at. So you as a forester learn to kind of become a little more cautious about making big changes. So if you're going to make changes, you want to have small bets, and you want to, kind of maybe we're not going to cut that tree down. We're going to see how it does, or we're not going to just mow things down. So it's part of it is just the culture of the industry in my mind. And it's a good thing, because the other side, honestly, that's kind of why I'm stuck with forestry and all this thing, because it's a love-hate thing. That they have this, they have this, we're not going to move fast, but foresters and forest management companies, in my opinion, are some of the best innovators that I've ever seen. And so you have this kind of, it's two sides to the same coin. And if you can finally get them to make the switch, they innovate, and then they do it amazingly. And I think about even for Jack Dangerman at Esri, the forest management companies were some of his very first customers in GIS, very first ones. And that's been a good thing and a bad thing. It's been a good thing because they're still using some of the same
That's
software.
true. That's true.
And it's been a bad thing because they have built a system that works and they are, a little tentative to move off of that system.
Yeah.
So that said, so what makes something change? And usually if it's a system that's working, it's hard to, that's called a legacy system. And the
Mhm.
definition of a legacy system is one that works. And so you just don't want to change it over unless there's external pressures that start to
Love
happen.
it. Love that definition.
Yeah. And so when I think about, I made this move to the Forest Stewardship Council, and this forest certification in my mind is hugely important, not only for, the good players that are out there, and there's a lot of them, but also for maybe laggards in the industry and maybe people who aren't even what I would call a company or participating in the industry, the corrupt, the political organizations, we've got illegal logging, we have
Yeah.
all these external pressures, climate change, corruption, frauds, human rights violations. When you start looking at this globally, these are external pressures that are being put on an industry that is becoming more and more critical to the path of our world. Climate change, we can have an impact on climate change through our forest management scenarios. So
Yeah.
going over to the Forest Stewardship Council, my role there is the senior technology officer. My role, I have two main things. One of them is to drive the adoption of tech, not only at FSC, but within our forest industry, certificate holders, all the rest of it. How can I enable the small holders, as we call them, the small companies, to participate in a way with technology that is going to help them raise their game, so to speak, and make them more viable, you know? And so the second part of my job is to drive partnerships within the technology industry. So those two parts of it, and it's kind of, I I'm so excited because I actually got to define what my job is. I met the CIO, Michael Marus, at the Forest Stewardship Council probably 3 years ago. Just super impressed with this guy. Really, really great guy. He's over in Bonn, Germany. And his vision is so good about how do we open up the supply chain? How do we make it visible, all the pieces of it? And so I sat down with him and we had this kind of conversation. And I said, here's really what we need to do. We need to drive tech adoption within the Forest Stewardship Council, which he is doing. And we need to get them up to speed to help all of our certificate holders, our auditors, all the rest of it. So we're off and running on that. And I said, the piece that's missing, Michael, is we also need to challenge the tech industry to participate in the problems of forest management and global forestry within the global industry. And so the second part of my job is driving those partnerships within the tech industry. So now this is, I'm going to go off on this, so you're going to have to go on this ride with me here, Kevin. So that one sounded cool. I was really excited about that because I've spent the bulk of my career in the tech industry. And then they said, okay, how are you going to do it? And then I'm like, okay, yeah, that's a good question. And so what we're doing now, and it's actually off and rolling. We're going to have our first meeting webcast in March, but I'm putting together, we're calling it the FSC Technology Consortium. So this is a group of what I consider the main players that could affect the global timber market, the global forest market. So, and they're, so Esri, obviously, I went and met with Jack and Michael Marus, our CIO, and I went down and met with Jack and his team back in November. And Jack, Jack's a longtime conservationist. Again, he's
Yeah,
always been,
he's in.
yeah, he's totally in. So his team will be part of that. Planet Imagery will be in there too. We're trying to work with Planet on developing change detection imagery that will allow us to see maybe areas where there's illegal logging going on, also see the impacts or the effects of forest certification on, you know, those lands that before and after the certification process. We've got Tableau dashboarding and business analytics involved. DocuSign is also a huge partner of ours. So these are the ones that we've already talked to that will be in March. Amazon Web Services, it has our blockchain. We have a blockchain pilot going right now, and AWS is part of that. Google, and I mentioned Planet already. So those are the main big ones.
Right.
And the idea with the tech consortium is that it's really would be a forum of partners, and it's not about funding. It's more about, I go back to the best relationships happen when you're solving a problem. So it's more about collaborative problem solving than anything. So that's
yeah. So no, that's super cool. So I want to dig into there a little bit more in just a moment, but I'm going to take us back a step and ask, because I know there's some listeners of this podcast, my sister, who is probably thinking, Scott, I don't even know what FSC is. Like, great, it sounds awesome, I can connect the dots, I think I know where you're going. But for those listeners, sorry, Jen, explain to our listeners who may not be familiar with FSC and who they are, what they're about, and what their mandate is.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. So yeah, and I've had that too. Even my wife, when I said, hey, I think I'm going to move over to Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, you know who they are. And she's like, no, I don't know who they are. Who are they? And I started trying to describe the mission. And I said, the best thing right now is just, you've got a Starbucks cup, just look at the side of it and you can see the FSC logo. FSC, the mission is really to promote environmentally sound, socially beneficial, and economically prosperous management of the world's forests. So it's a certification scheme that has three main bodies to it. It has the environmental compliance piece of it, and it has the economic. You have to have viable companies out there as well. And then it has the social and indigenous rights as part of that certification scheme. The social part of it, for me, the indigenous rights and voice is very important, but also the rural communities that make their livings, even here in the US and in Canada, in the forest. A lot of times they are not, you know, sometimes they don't get the credit or get the voice that they need when it comes to the forest management piece of it. So they have three main certifications. The first one is forest management. So you can get a certification for managing your forest in a sustainable way. And that includes, you know, how you're treating your workers, your growth, your cut cycles, the biodiversity, all those pieces of it are important. The next part of that, and the one I'm most excited about, is the chain of custody certifications. So, I mean, everybody in the timber industry knows chain of custody has been kind of a problem for a long time. How do we know that this log cut from this harvest unit is actually the same log that made it to the mill or is in your toilet paper or, you know, your building products? So that chain of custody certification is where we're really working on our blockchain pilot and how we're adopting technology for that. And then the last certification is what we call a promotional license, the ability to put the FSC logo on Costco toilet paper, or, you know, if you go to Costco now, most of their paper goods are all FSC certified. So that's another type of certificate as well.
Yeah, very cool. I love the example. It makes me laugh because I think of some colleagues that have joined the forestry space, and everyone has their views about forestry, and they tend to be on maybe one extreme or the other. And I remember this person saying, you know, before I make this decision, I should probably inventory what parts of my life touch forestry. And they did that. They went and started looking like, where do I have wood products? And they were flabbergasted, and they took the job. on the systems. There was a technology role within a large integrated forest products company, but they took the job because they realized, I won't say they're naive, but maybe they didn't realize how much
Oh yeah.
trees played a part of their lives, right? And I always joke, and you know this, we can make glass from wood. It's like there's probably
Yep.
wood in my shirt that I'm wearing right
Cellulose.
now. It's not just toilet paper. It's like, yeah, we need that, but in any event, it's crazy to think about that. I want to ask you, I'm curious, I'm dying to know now, and I got like 20 bajillion questions in my head on things you said. First, sounds like a dream job, and as you
I'm
described it, I'm
excited.
like,
Yeah, I'm
kudos to you,
definitely.
man. That's awesome. But this blockchain thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
tell me more about this pilot, or what can you share on that? Because I know in feedback from this podcast, there are some digital foresters that are very young.
Hmm.
And so while they love hearing about, you know, our walk down memory lane, they're also thinking
Yeah.
about, what's coming, and this
Where
is
are we
language they
going?
resonate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe
Yeah.
what can you share about this blockchain pilot? Where did it come from? What are you trying to achieve? And obviously you're tying it to chain of custody, but what can you share on that?
So blockchain is really just a distributed ledger, right? So it's just being able that everyone who is involved in the business transaction has a little piece of the information that goes into a blockchain. So we are focused our blockchain pilot in the Ukraine, and it's an area where there is a level of corruption, there's a level of distrust, and so everyone can participate in the blockchain without necessarily sharing details or information that they don't want to
Cool.
share. So that's the beginning of it. So when I go to, and I'm trying to, I have obviously always have sorts of conceptual architectures and the rest of it. So the blockchain ecosystem that we have, and can I share that? I'm not going to do that. Part of what we're doing with, and again, I mentioned our FSC Technology Consortium. Each one of those folks has kind of a piece of this blockchain ecosystem. So the whole idea is, okay, every time in a chain of custody workflow, we cut the tree. We make a log deck. There's a certain number of trees in that log deck. There's a record that's associated with the log inventory management. And then that log is loaded onto a truck. Every one of those transactions has a data element to it, all the way clear out to Costco and you buying toilet paper. So, and not that all trees turn into toilet paper, but the idea there is there's a lot of things that happen along that
For sure.
blockchain, and how do we make sure that we're not losing track of all of that? And that's really the main goal behind our blockchain ecosystem. And there's blockchain is, for us at FSC, we realize it's not going to fit in all the places, but when you have some place that has a lot of corruption and fraud, and actually our certificates get used where they shouldn't be using our certificates.
True.
So how do you guarantee that? And blockchain is one way of doing that in an area where there's a lot of corruption, where there's not a lot of trust. And so that's the main scenario behind that.
Yeah,
So
perfect use case for blockchain. Absolutely. I love how you describe using FSC as a vehicle to, well, maybe I'll put the words in your mouth, but using FSC as a vehicle to affect change and maybe break down some barriers or impediments or common objections you and I have heard all the time. But you made a comment earlier in terms of, maybe I'll paraphrase, but kind of getting the smaller organizations to come along. Tell me more about that and how that could work, or how you see that working with getting tech in front of that. Is that really case studies, pilots, or do you have something
no,
ingenious in mind?
no. So this is, and I hate to admit this, I got goosebumps because this is an area where it's all of a sudden taking off. Like sometimes you take a job and you just land in the right place at the right time. And I just feel like I'm there right now. So part of FSC's whole thing is, how do we, whatever certification process or audit process or whatever criteria we come up with, how do we encourage the small landowners or the small community forests, or those, not just the big dogs, because they've got the resources to do it, but how do we help the smaller players too? So if we're doing these rules and all the rest of it, how do we ensure that we're not creating a hurdle for entry for somebody who's trying to get into it. And technology
Right.
is kind of, again, the way that happens. So just recently, one thing that FSC does every 2 years is we have a general, what is it called? General Assembly. And so we've got like 2,000 members of this General Assembly. Some of them are actual logging companies or timber companies. Some of them are, indigenous tribes and all the rest. And that assembly comes together and they start voting on how they want to change the regs, how they want to ensure that we're doing a better job. Carbon ecosystem services, that was a big thing this year. This year, for the first time, everyone agreed that we should be requiring the GIS boundaries for the harvest units that allow us to move that along. In the past, that is not, the big players and could go ahead and submit that, that's awesome. We'd love to have that. But we couldn't really make it as a rule because we thought it might be too hard because there was too high of a bar to enter with GIS or technology and the rest of it. So we have in place a fantastic GIS infrastructure. And so one of the conversations with Jack was, how do we do this in a way that we can encourage these small folks to come in, do their heads up digitizing on a tool that we're providing for them. And, it's not magic, but if you're a guy who owns, 1,200 acres and you don't know GIS and it's your family timber farm, how do you do that? Where do you go with that? And so this is to get that information, get those tools out to those smallholders, as we call them, and give them tools so they can better manage their lands, not to the level of what Limb Geomatics does, but it's just, how about make a map of the harvest unit and a general age class? You'd be shocked, Kevin, at no, you wouldn't. You know this, how many people don't have just a general age class of their timbers out there. So that's part of it. The other part of it is, I go back to the idea of, how do we connect these small farmers to the end market out there? And my favorite example of that is in the rubber industry. We're working in Indonesia as well, certifying rubber plantations. And so Pirelli tires just released their first FSC certified tire from natural rubber. And so that was like, wow, all of a sudden this light went on with a lot of the rubber companies. And it's actually brilliant of Pirelli, because what Pirelli was doing is saying that, hey, if we do this, we're going to get out in front. It's a highly competitive market. Natural rubber has a very narrow growing area. We can get out in front of this, build these relationships with the farmers down here through the certification scheme, and we guarantee ourselves rubber. And so that idea created an e-registry, so those farmers can come in, register, and connect with potential buyers that are out there as well. So we're doing this. We're on the same trajectory with our carbon certification and ecosystem services and some of the rest of it. So
yeah, very cool. Well, now I know why I couldn't get Pirelli winter tires. It wasn't the supply chain; it was the FSC certification. I'm just joking, of course. Not about not being able to get Pirellis. Couldn't get any winter tires for my new car this year. But side story, yeah, amazing. And as you described that, Scott, it kind of, and you and I know this. What is sexy, cool, hot to us, and then we kind of move on.
Yeah,
we sometimes forget that there's all these people that, like, this is a game changer. And as people who live and breathe technology, sometimes we get caught in not chasing the shiny things, but moving on to too many shiny things at once and maybe not kind of connecting the dots. So it's great to hear the initiatives, the work you're doing. And I can sense it as you talk about it. It's like you're getting goosebumps. It's like I get goosebumps because I can sense it, the energy, the enthusiasm as you're talking about this. And that's awesome. It's like, what better place to be than in a career in a spot that you're supported and you have the flexibility, obviously, to explore these different ideas. So our time is flying by, and I'm curious to get your feedback on people who are listening to this, foresters, maybe soon to be digital foresters, looking for pro tips from you in terms of where do I start? Where do I get started? You know, you have this rich career in geospatial, you know, environmental. You're obviously in a key role right now with FSC. But for that person who has the, you know, the 600 acres, doesn't have a GIS background, as much as some listeners might go, there's not that many out there. We know there's many of them out
There's
there.
a lot.
How do they get started? What's your tip on, you know, just do this one thing? That's all we ask, you know, from an accountability point of view. Often, you know, in coaching, it's like, just do this one thing before we talk next time. What would that pro tip be?
Well,
Aside from hire someone young
no,
or
no, 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 that's not where I'm going to go at all. Actually, where I was going to go is from a personal experience. I was living on a friend of mine's timber farm, a family friend, and he's at an age where he's in his 70s and he's got two sons, and it's a timber farm that he's been hands off on, and he's had somebody else managing, a forester. And he came to me, and I was living there, and I toured his whole farm, and I said, "Hey, do you have a map?" And he's like, "Well, you know, I know where everything's at. I can draw it on a napkin." And I'm like, "Okay, no." So where do you start if you're a smallholder? Get a map, even hand drawn. Start with that map. Take a picture of it. You can convert the picture to, I mean, you just got to start somewhere. And a map is everything we do, every single activity we do as foresters relates to a place on the ground. That is the absolute truth, the absolute beginning. So once you do that, you can convert it to a PDF. And everyone at Esri, as soon as I say this, is going to freak out. But you can load it into, there's apps that you can get for nothing and put your own PDF of your own timber farm.
yeah, like
in
Avenza maps and stuff like that. Yep.
Avenza. I didn't say it. You
I
said it.
said it. It's okay. So I'm gonna get in trouble now. Yeah, it's like I know the president of Enza. You owe me one now. Anything that comes back, I'm just joking
But
there.
and I'm just joking, because that is really, the map is the beginning, and it's actually how I started my career too, just mapping a forest. And it's so amazing to do that. And now you've got this thing you can look at and think about and get all these details out of it. And then that gets to your handheld device, and the ability to go out with data into your forest is the most amazing thing, because you forget stuff. You go out there,
Absolutely.
you get your maps, your paper maps spread out there. It's raining like crazy. So mobile device, go in through the mobile gate.
Absolutely. Yeah, game changer there for sure. So as I said earlier, time's flying by. I'm loving this conversation. I'm curious, as customary in this podcast, as we kind of come to the tail end, I always like to poke people's brain, and now that everyone's the neurons are firing, what's the future look like from your seat? You've lived it, you breathe it, you've achieved success, you know, done things a lot of people haven't done. You're in a great position now to affect change, make an impact, obviously. But if we think 1-3 year time frame, what gets you excited beyond what we talked about today and your work? Are there things that are even beyond your old FSC that you're just like, man, once I crush this, I'm going to go after this thing? Is there something out there that you know, the dots are shining out there, you're trying to connect?
Yeah, it's a fun question, because for me, again, so what's going to happen next is globally, the timber industry, the forest market is going to connect. And so you have to be ready to play in that. And again, FSC is a global certification. I know you've got customers all over the place, Kevin, too, all of these. And it's the technology piece of it that is going to connect all of these timberlands together in a way that allow us to better understand where we're going. So climate change, I'm going to say it, some people can do what they want about this, but climate change is one of the biggest game changers that we're going to see. It's also a huge wealth making opportunity. And I think that the timber industry and the forest market, timberlands, are poised to reap huge benefits from that. And we've got carbon on the horizon, ecosystem services, all of those sorts of things.
For sure.
There's a lot of money right now just floating around in startup space around carbon certification. And I just think that that is a market that is, people have been talking about it forever, but there's like this, this groundswell that's starting to happen, the wheels spinning up, and you better be poised for that full spinning wheel, or
Is
you're
that
going to miss the.
is that something you think that maybe surprised you, like the whole climate tech movement with a different pool of money coming in, different dry powder coming to the table? Is that something that maybe surprised you?
Well, the amount of startup VC on that is what surprised me. I'm working with I've been talking to, I'll just say this, there's a startup company down in the Bay Area that is doing a lot of stuff, and they just, I mean, the venture capital that they've had come in to them is just incredible. And so I am surprised by the amount of venture capital, because I'm kind of old school where, the startups, I participated in that startup mentality, but I'm this old school where you make something, you sell it, you get the money, and then you reinvest it. And so to have like 10 or 20 million dollars show up, and they're just like, we want you to make something, we want you to innovate. That's something I didn't know about. We'll just say that.
In the forestry space, and certainly this past year has been crazy, right? You got
Yeah.
startups raising 25 50x multiples there. That's unheard of. Whether that continues is a whole different story.
Well, whether it does or doesn't, there is innovation that will happen out of that.
Absolutely.
So there's going to be a lot of startups that just flop, but there will be little nuggets of tech and learning that happen in those startups. So
for sure. Well, they're going fast. The VCs want them to go 100 miles an hour, hit that wall 100 miles an hour, pick yourself up, do it again. But they're betting on one to succeed, right? And so totally makes sense. So as we wind down, I suspect a lot of folks are probably listening to this. The Fsc Technology Consortia. First time I've heard about it. So thanks for sharing that. Love the vision, the idea where you're taking that, but lots of other things you talked about. I suspect some of our listeners, or our viewers and listeners for that matter, are going to want to follow up and say, how can I get involved? How can I participate? Or I need some help. What's the best way people can get a hold of you? Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, just old school email, or
I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitter all the time. I'm definitely on LinkedIn, and it's Scot with one T, McQueen, McQueen. But you can always email me, s.mcqueen@fsc.org. So, and I'm based here in Olympia, Washington. So if you're in Olympia or this Northwest region, I'm more than happy to meet with you as well.
Yeah. So last final question. When's the first trip into the Tin Cup, the good old airplane thing that we used to always ride all the time? Do you have a trip planned? And if so, is it vacation or is it?
Well, I have to go back to Bonn in March, but I actually flew to Bonn in late September, worked for 3 weeks. On the last 2 days before I left, I tested positive for COVID and I was in quarantine for 2 weeks. So I was in Bonn for 5 weeks.
Wow.
So I've already been out there. I don't recommend COVID for anyone. Fully vaccinated, by the way, too. So.
Yes. Well, it's interesting times, especially these days with Omicron. It's touching everybody. It's no longer several degrees of freedom removed. It's very close to that. So cool that, hey, I'm jealous. I haven't been in a rocket ship since February 2020. I can't really say I miss it either. It's
parts
like
of it.
Yeah, you miss parts of it, but when you're logging 100,000 miles in the area, the appeal just vanishes very quickly. So there you have it, folks. Reach Scot via Twitter or email s.mcqueen@fsc.org. Did I get that right, Scot?
You got it.
All right, man. Well, hey, everyone's busy these days. I am so pleased that you're able to carve off some time for this guy and our audience, our viewership and listeners. Last words to you, my friend.
Well, thank you. Thank you for everyone. I love this industry and all the people in it. I just like being here.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. And again, appreciate your time, and we'll chat soon.
Great. Thanks, Kevin.
All right. Thank you.